and empty purses. A note of satisfaction entered Massima's voice. He despised greed, but then he despised any weakness, great or small. I think they will part with their grain very cheaply now. Aaron smelled a trap, and it did not take a wolf's nose. Massima had his own men and horses to feed, and no matter how thoroughly they had scoured the country they crossed, they could not be in much better shape than Perrin's own people. Why had Massima not sent a few thousand of his followers into this town and taken whatever it held? A day back. That would take him farther from Fail, and maybe give the Shido time to gain ground again.
Hey,
Was that the reason for this
doing?
peculiar offer? Or a further delay
Good
to
to
keep
see
Massima
ya.
in the west, close to his Shonchan friends? Perhaps there will be time to visit
Let
this
me
town
get
after my
stuff
wife is
finished,
free.
set up, and
Once again, Perrin's ears caught the faint
I
sound
got
of
somewhat of a
horses moving through the forest
chair
before
to
anyone
work
else,
temporarily.
coming from the west this time, from the camp. Galen's messenger must have galloped the whole way. Your wife, Massima said in a flat voice, directing a look at Berylane that made Perrin's blood boil. Even Berylane colored, though her face
We
remained
can
smooth.
set stuff set up, and
Do you really believe
we'll
you will
do a
have word of her
dab.
today?
And I
I
roll
do.
a couple up.
Perrin's voice was as flat as Massima's, and harder. He clutched the pommel of his saddle, tapped the hoop handles of Berlane's basket to keep from reaching for his axe. Freeing her comes first. Her and the others. We can fill our bellies to bursting once that's done, but that comes first.
Let me fix the chair.
The horses approaching were audible to everyone now. A long line of lancers appeared to the west, shifting through the shadowed trees with another mounted line behind it. The red streamers and breastplates of Mayenne interspersed with the green streamers and burnished breastplates of Gildan. The lines stretched from opposite Perrin down below the mass of horsemen who were waiting on Massima. Men afoot ghosted from tree to tree, carrying long Two Rivers bows. Perrin found himself hoping they
Hey,
had not
John
stepped the camp
McDonald,
too
how you
far.
doing?
Stealing that Shonchan paper might have forced Massima's hand.
I
He was a
gotta
veteran of fighting along
fix
the
this
Blight
chair
against the
again.
Aiel. He might have thought further ahead than simply riding out to find Berylane. It was like another blacksmith's puzzle. Move one piece to shift another just enough to let a third slip free. A camp with weakened defenders could be overrun, and in these woods numbers could count for as much as who had people channeling. Did Massima want to keep his secret enough to try putting a seal to it here and now? Perrin realized that he had moved one hand to rest on his axe, but he left it there. Among the mass of Massima's followers, horses moved nervously at tugs from their riders. Men shouted and waved weapons, but Massima himself studied the oncoming lancers and bowmen with no change of expression, neither more dour nor less. They might have been birds hopping from branch to branch. The smell of him writhed madly, unchanging. What is done to serve the light must be done, he said, when the newcomers halted, some 200 paces away.
Okay.
That was easy
better.
range for Two Rivers bowmen,
Somewhat.
and Massima had seen demonstrations. He gave no sign
It's
that
not
thought
to be
had
very
champed might be
comfortable,
in his
but
heart. All else is dross and trash.
yeah, let me get my live done.
Remember that, Lord Perrin Golden Eyes. Everything else is dross and trash. Jerking his sorrel around without another word, he headed back toward his waiting men, trailed by Nengar and Bartu, all three pushing their horses without a care for broken legs or broken heads. The waiting company fell in behind, the mob flowing south now.
Hell
A few
yeah.
men
Let
at the
me
tail end
get my
stopped to
dab
drag a
ready
limb
real
shaped
quick.
from under the injured horse and put the animal out of its misery with a quick slash of a dagger. Then they began gutting and butchering. That much meat could not be allowed to go to
Puffco
waste.
proxy did a.
The rider, they left where they had dropped.
I got this for
He
little,
believes every word he says.
attachment from
Nora
MJ
breathed.
Arsenal.
But where does his belief lead him? Perrin considered asking her straight
There's
out
still a
where
little
she
bit
thought
in there.
Massima's belief was leading him.
Let's do
Where
this
she
up and then
wanted to lead him. But she suddenly put on that impenetrable Aes
we'll
Sedai calm.
do
The tip of her sharp nose had turned red from the
a
cold.
load of fresh
She
one.
regarded him with a level stare. You could pry that dark and marked
Then we'll
stone
roll
out of
it
the
up.
ground barehanded as easily as get an answer from an Aes Sedai who wore that look. He would have to leave questions to Berylane. The man who had brought the
Trying to get
lancers
stuff,
suddenly spurred his horse forward.
Ready for all
A short,
that.
compact fellow in a silver-plated breastplate and a helmet with a barred face guard and 3 short white plumes. Gerard Arganda was a tough man, a soldier who had worked his way up from the bottom, against all
There
odds,
we
to
go.
become the first captain of Alyandra's bodyguard. He had no liking for Perrin, who had brought his queen south for no good reason and gotten her kidnapped. But Perrin expected him to stop and make his respects to Berylane, perhaps confer with Galen. Arganda had a great deal of respect for Galen, and often spent time with him, both smoking their pipes. Instead, the roan floundered past Perrin and the others, Arganda digging his heels into the animal's sides, trying to force more speed. When Perrin saw where the man was heading, he understood. A single horseman on a mouse-colored animal was approaching from the east at a steady walk. Beside him, Nail shuffled along on snowshoes.
Give me 1 second.
Chapter 8. Whirlpools of Color. Perrin did not realize he had moved until he found himself crouched over Stepper's neck, screeching after Arganda.
Get my
The
other
snow was
dab
no less
rig.
deep, the ground no smoother, the light no
right back.
better, but Stepper raced through the shadows, unwilling to let the roan stay in the lead. Perrin urged him to run faster. The approaching rider was Elias, his beard fanned out over his chest, a broad-brimmed hat casting his face in shadows, and his fur-lined cloak hanging down his back. The Aiel was one of the maidens, with a dark shupa wrapped around her head and a white cloak, used for hunting against the snow, worn over her coat and breeches of grays and browns and greens. Elias and one maiden, without the others, meant Fail had been found. It had to. Arganda ran his horse without a care for whether he broke the roan's neck or his own, leaping stone outcrops, splashing through the snow at a near gallop. But Stepper overtook him just as he reached Elias and demanded in a harsh voice, "Did you see the queen, Machera? Is she alive? Tell me, man." The maiden, Elienda, her sun-darkened
My
face
Dr.
expressionless,
Dabber
raised a
XS.
hand to Perrin. It might have been meant for a greeting or sympathy, but she never broke her skimming stride.
Okay.
With Elias to make his report to
Let me
Perrin,
get
she
position
would
in
carry
this
hers to
chair
the wise
again.
ones. "You found her?" Perrin's throat was suddenly dry as sand. He had waited so long for this. Arganda snarled soundlessly through the steel bars of his helmet's face guard, knowing that Perrin was not asking after Aleandra. "We found the shadow we've been following," Elias said carefully, both hands on the pommel of his saddle. Even Elias,
Okay.
the fabled Longtooth, who had lived and run with wolves, was
Gotta
showing
put
a
a
strain
dab
of
in
too
this
many
one now.
miles and not enough sleep. His whole face sagged with a weariness emphasized by the golden yellow glow of his eyes beneath his hat brim. Gray streaked his thick beard, and the hair that he wore hanging to his waist and tied with a leather cord at the nape of his neck. And for the first time since Perrin had known him, he looked old. "They're camped around a fair-sized town they took, in ridge country near 40 miles from here. They've got no sentries to speak of close in, and those further out seem to be watching for prisoners trying to escape more than anything else. So we got near enough for a good look. But Perrin, there are more of them than we thought. At least 9 or 10 sects, the maidens say. Counting Gaishine, folks in white anyway. There could be as many people in that camp as in Mayen or Abu Dar. I don't know how many spear fighters, but 10,000 might be on the low side from what I saw." Knots of desperation twisted and tightened in Perrin's stomach. His mouth was so dry he could not have spoken had Fail miraculously appeared in front of him. 10,000 Al-Gaid Siswai, and even weavers and silversmiths and old men who passed their days reminiscing in the shade would pick up a spear if they were attacked. He had fewer than 2,000 lancers, and they would have been overmatched against an equal number of Aiel. Fewer than 300 Two Rivers men, who could wreak havoc with their bows at a distance, but not stop 10,000. That many shadow would shred Massima's murderous rabble like a cat slaughtering a nest of mice. Even counting the Ashaman and the wise ones in Aes Sedai, Adara and the other wise ones were hardly generous in what they told him about wise ones. But he knew 10 sects might have 50 women who could channel, maybe more. Maybe fewer, too. There was no set number, but not enough fewer to make a difference. With an effort, he strangled the despair welling up in him, squeezed until only writhing filaments remained for his anger to burn up. A hammer had no place in it for despair. 10 septs, for the whole Shido clan. They still had Fail, and he still had to find a way. "What does it matter how many there are?" Aram demanded. "When Trollocs came to the Two Rivers, there were thousands, tens of thousands, but we killed them just the same. Shido can't be worse than Trollocs." Perrin blinked, surprised to find the man right behind him, not to mention Berelain and Galen and the Aes Sedai. In his haste to reach the wall, he had shut out everything else. Dimly visible through the trees, the men Arganda had brought out to confront Massima still held their rough lines, but Berelain's bodyguard was forming a loose ring centered on Elias and facing upward. The wise ones stood outside the circle, listening to Elienda with grave faces. She spoke in a low murmur, sometimes shaking her head. Her view of matters was no brighter than Elias's. He must have lost the basket in his haste or thrown it away because it hung from Berelain's saddle now. There was a look
We
of
do another one,
bitter
but
sympathy on her face. Burning, he was too tired to think straight.
I was going to
Only now
roll
more
up
than
real
ever he
quick.
had to think straight. His next mistake might be the last for Fayou. Way I heard it, Tinker, Elias said quietly. The Trollocs came to you in the Two Rivers. You managed to catch them in a vice. Do you have any fancy plans for catching a Shido in a vice? Aram glared at him sullenly. Elias had known him before he picked up a sword, and Aram disliked being reminded of that time, despite his brightly colored clothes. 10 sets or 50, Arganda growled.
I'll be right
There must
back.
be some way to free the Queen.
Gotta
And
go get
the
my
others, of
grinder real
course.
quick.
And the others.
Right when I got
His
comfortable.
hard-bitten face was creased in a scowl of anger, yet he smelled frantic. A fox ready to chew off its own leg to escape a trap. Will they accept a ransom? The Gildanon looked around until he found Marlene coming through the winged guards. She managed a steady stride in spite of the snow, not staggering in the least. The other wise ones were no longer anywhere to be seen among the trees, nor Elienda. Will these Shido take a ransom? Wise one? Arganda's honorific had the sound of an afterthought. He no longer believed the Aiel with them had any knowledge of the kidnapping, but there was a taint in him regarding Aiel. I cannot say. Marlene's arms folded across her chest, she stood looking at Perrin, rather than Arganda. It was one of those looks where a woman weighed and measured you, so she could have sewn you a suit of clothes or told you when your small clothes were last washed. It would have made him uncomfortable back when he had had time for such things. When she spoke again, there was nothing of offering advice in her tone, merely a setting out of the facts. She might even have meant it so. Your wetlander paying of ransom goes against our custom. Gaishine may be given as a gift, traded for other Gaishine, but they are not animals to be sold. Yet it seems the Shadow no longer follow Giotto. They make wetlanders Gaishine and take everything instead of only the fit. They may set a price. My jewels are at your disposal, Perrin, Berlane put in, her voice steady and her face firm. If necessary, Grady O'Neill can fetch more from Mayen. Gold as well. Galen cleared his throat. Altarans are used to marauders, milady. Neighboring nobles and brigands alike, he said slowly, slapping his reins against his palm. Although reluctant to contradict Berlane, he clearly intended to anyway. There's no law this far from the Budar except what the local lord or lady says. Noble or common, they're accustomed to paying off anyone they can't fight off, and quick to tell the difference. It goes against reason that none of them tried to buy safety, yet we've seen nothing but ruins in these Shido's path, heard of nothing but pillage right down to the ground. They may accept an offer of ransom, and even take it, but can they be trusted to give anything in return? Just making the offer gives away our one real advantage, that they don't know we are here. Anura shook her head slightly, the barest movement, but Galen's one eye caught it, and he frowned. You disagree, Anura, said I? He asked politely, and with a hint of surprise. The Grey was almost diffident at times, especially for a sister, but she never vacillated about speaking up when she disagreed with advice offered to Berlane. This time, Anura hesitated, though, uncovered by pulling a cloak around herself and arranging the folds with care. It was clumsy of her. Aes Sedai could ignore heated cold when they chose, remaining untouched when everyone around them was drenched with sweat or fighting to stop their teeth chattering. An Aes Sedai who paid attention to the temperature was buying time to think, usually about how to hide what she was thinking. Glancing toward Marlene with a small frown, she finally reached a decision, and the slight crease in her forehead vanished. Negotiation is always better than fighting, she said in cool Tarabana accents. And in negotiation, trust is always a matter of the precautions, yes? We must consider with care the precautions that must be taken. There is also the question of who is to approach them. Wise ones may no longer be sacrosanct, since they took part in the Battle of Dumai's Wells. A sister, or a group of sisters, might be better, yet even that must have careful arrangement. I myself am willing to... No ransom, Perrin said, and when everyone stared at him, most in consternation, Nora with her face unreadable, he said it again in a harder voice. No ransom. He would not pay these Shido for making Fayou suffer. She would be afraid, and they had to pay for that, not profit from it. Besides, Galen had the right of it. Nothing Perrin had seen in Altara or Amadisia, or before that in Kyrien, so much as hinted that the shadow could be trusted to keep any bargain. As well trust rats in the grain bins and cutworms with the harvest. Elias, I want to see their camp. When he was a boy, he had known a blind man, Nat Torfin, with his wrinkled face and thin white hair, who could disassemble any blacksmith's puzzle by touch. For years, Perrin tried to learn how to duplicate that feat, but he never could. He had to see how the pieces fit together before he could make sense of them. Aram, find Grady and tell him to meet me as fast as he can at the traveling ground. That was what they had come to call the place where they arrived at the end of each jump and departed from for the next. It was easier for the Asherman to leave a gateway in a place already touched by one they had woven before. Aram gave one short, purposeful nod, then wheeled his gray and sped toward camp. But Perrin could see arguments and questions and demands gathering on the faces around him. Marlene was still examining him, as though suddenly not quite sure what he was. Galen was frowning at the reins in his hands, no doubt seeing matters turn out badly whatever he did. But Berlane wore a perturbed expression, objections visible in her eyes, and Nora's mouth had tightened to a thin line. Aes Sedai disliked being interrupted, and diffident for an Aes Sedai or not, she looked ready to vent her displeasure. Arganda, his face growing red, opened his mouth with the clear intention of shouting. Arganda had shouted often since his queen was kidnapped. There was no point in waiting to listen. Digging in his heels, Perrin sent Stepper lunging through the line of winged guards, heading back toward the sheared trees. Not at a run, but not dawdling either. A quick trot through the towering forests, hands tight on the reins and eyes already searching the dappled gloom for Grady. Elias followed on his gelding without a word. Perrin had been sure he had no room in him for another ounce of fear, yet Elias's silence made the weight grow. The other man never saw an obstacle without seeing a way around. His silence shadowed up impassable mountains. There had to be a way, though. When they reached the smooth stone outcrop, Perrin walked Stepper back and forth through the slanting bars of light, around the toppled trees and between the standing ones, unable to make himself stop. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way. His mind darted like a caged rabbit. Elias dismounted to squat and frown at the sliced stone, paying little heed to his gelding tugging at the reins and trying to back away. Beside the stone, the thick trunk of a pine that had stood a good 50 paces tall was propped up at one end by the splintered remains of its stump, high enough that Elias could have walked beneath the tree trunk upright. Brilliant rays of sunlight piercing the forest canopy elsewhere seemed to deepen the shadow to near blackness around the track-marked outcrop, but that troubled him no more than it did Perrin. His nose wrinkled at the burnt sulfur smell that still hung in the air. I thought I caught this stink on the way here. I expect you'd have mentioned this if you didn't have things on your mind. A big pack. Bigger than anything I've ever seen or heard of. That's what Missouri said, Perrin said absently. What was keeping Grady? How many people were there in Abu Dar? That was the size of the shadow camp. She said she's crossed the paths of 7 packs, and this isn't one she's seen before. 7? Elias murmured in surprise. Even an Aes Sedai would have to go some to do that. Most tales of dark hounds are just people frightened by the dark. Frowning at the tracks crossing the smoothed stone, he shook his head, and sadness entered his voice when he said, They were wolves once. The souls of wolves, anyway, caught and twisted by the shadow. That was the core used to make dark hounds, the Shadow Brothers. I think that's why the wolves have to be at the last battle. Or maybe dark hounds were made because wolves will be there to fight them. The pattern makes Savara lace look like a piece of string sometimes. Anyway, it was a long time ago, during the Trolloc Wars, as near as I can make out, and the War of the Shadow before that. Wolves have long memories. What a wolf knows is never really forgotten while other wolves remain alive. They avoid talking about dark hounds, though, and they avoid dark hounds, too. 100 wolves could die trying to kill one Shadow Brother. Worse, if they fail, a dark hound can eat the souls of those that aren't quite dead yet. And in a year or so, there'd be a new pack of Shadow Brothers that didn't remember ever being wolves. I hope they don't remember anyway. Perrin reined in, though he itched to keep moving. Shadow Brothers. The wolves' name for darkhounds had taken on a new grimness. Can they eat a man's soul, Elias? Say a man who can talk to wolves? Elias shrugged. Only a handful of people could do what they did, as far as either man knew. An answer to that question might come only at the point of death. More importantly, right then, if they had been wolves once, they must be intelligent enough to report what they found. Masuri had implied as much. Foolishness to hope otherwise. How long before they did? How long did he have to free Fayo? The sound of hooves crunching in snow announced riders coming, and he hurriedly told Elias that the darkhounds had circled the camp, that they would be carrying word of him to whomever they reported to. I wouldn't worry overmuch, boy, the older man replied, watching warily for sight of the oncoming horses. Moving away from the stone, he began to stretch, working muscles overlong in the saddle. Elias was too careful to be caught studying what would be swallowed in shadows to other eyes. Sounds like they're hunting something more important than you. They'll stay on that till they find it, if it takes all year. Don't worry. We'll get your wife up before those darkhounds report you were here. Not saying it'll be easy, but we'll do it. There was determination in his voice and in his scent, but not much hope. Almost none at all, in fact. Fighting despair, refusing to let it rise again, Baron resumed walking stepper as Berlane and her bodyguard appeared through the trees, with Marlene astride behind Anura. As soon as the Aes Sedai drew rein, the twilight-eyed wise one slid to the ground, shaking down her thick skirts to cover her dark stockings. Another woman might have appeared flustered over having her legs exposed, but not Marlene. She was merely straightening her clothes. Anura was the one who looked upset, a sour-faced disgruntlement that made her nose seem more like a beak. She kept silent, but her mouth was set to bite. She must have been certain her offer to negotiate with the Shadow would be accepted, especially with Berlane supporting, and Marlene seemingly neutral at worst. Greys were negotiators and mediators, adjudicators and treaty makers. That might have been her motivation. What else could it have been? A problem that he had to set aside while keeping it in mind. He had to take into account anything that might interfere with freeing Fayo, but the problem he had to solve lay 40 miles to the northeast. While the winged guards formed their protective circle among the towering trees around the traveling ground, Berlane brought her bay alongside Stepper and paced him, trying to engage Perrin in talk, to entice him with the rest of the woodhen. She smelled uncertain, doubtful of his decision. Maybe she hoped to talk him into attempting the ransom. He kept Stepper moving and refused to listen. To make that attempt was to gamble everything on one toss of the dice. He could not gamble with Fayo as the stake. Methodical as working at a forge, that was the way. Light, but he was tired. He folded himself in tighter around his anger, embracing the heat for energy. Galen and Arganda arrived shortly after Berlane, with a double column of Yldanan lancers in burnished breastplates and bright conical helmets who interspersed themselves among the Mayenners between the trees. A trace of irritation entering her scent, Berlane left Perrin and rode to Galen. The pair of them sat their horses knee to knee, the one-eyed man bending his head to listen to what Berlane had to say. Her voice was low, but Perrin knew their subject, at least in part. Now and then one of them glanced at him as he walked a stepper back and forth, back and forth. Arganda planted his roan in one spot and stared south through the trees toward the camp, still as a statue, yet radiating impatience as a fire radiated heat. He was the picture of a soldier, with his plumes and his sword and his silvered armor, his face as hard as stone, but he smelled on the brink of panic. Perrin wondered how he himself smelled. You could never catch your own scent unless you were in a closed space. He did not think he smelled of panic, just fear and anger. All would be well once he had Fayo back. All would be well then. Back and forth, back and forth. At last Aram appeared, with a yawning Jergrady and a dark bay gelding, dark enough that the white stripe on its nose made it seem almost a black. Daniel and a dozen Two Rivers men, spears and halberds abandoned for the moment in favor of their longbows, rode close behind, but not too close. A stocky fellow with a weathered face already beginning to show creases, though he was short of his middle years yet.
Oh, yeah,
Grady looked like
fire.
a sleepy farmer, despite the long
Oh, it's
hook of
not
silver
going
at his
too
waist,
bad, but that's
black
cool.
coat,
You got your
silver
right
sword, and a high
fixed.
collar. But he had
Just
left the
getting
farm
one rolled
behind
up, and
forever,
then we do another
and
dab.
Daniel and the others always gave him room. They gave Perrin room, too, hanging back and peering at the ground, sometimes darting quick, embarrassed looks at him or Barrowline. It did not matter. All would be well. Aram tried to lead Grady to Perrin, but the Ashaman knew why he had been summoned. With a sigh, he climbed down beside Elias, who squatted in a patch of sunlight to mark a map in the snow with his finger, and speak of distance and direction, describing the place he wanted to go in detail, a clearing on a slope that faced almost south, with the ridge above notched in 3 places. Distance and direction were enough, if the distance and direction were precise, but the better the picture in an Ashaman's mind,
But
the closer he could come to an exact spot.
give me 1 second. I've got to make a
There's
quick
no margin for
little
error
pit
here,
stop.
boy. Elias's eyes seemed to brighten with intensity.
Before I do
others thought
that,
of
let me get
Ashaman,
stuff
they never intimidated
put
him.
up here.
There's lots of ridges in that country, and the main camp is only a mile or so the other side of this one. There'll be sentries, little parties that camp in a different place every night, maybe less than 2 miles the other way. If you put us off by much,
Be
we'll
right
be
back.
seen for sure. Brady met that stare, unblinking. Then he nodded and scrubbed stubby fingers through his hair, drawing a deep breath. He looked as weary as Elias, as bone-tired as Perrin felt. Making gateways, holding them open long enough for thousands of people and horses to pass through, was wearing work. Are you rested enough? Perrin asked him. Tired men made mistakes. Mistakes with the one power could be deadly. Should I send for Niald? Grady stared up at him blearily, then shook his head. Pager's no more rested than me. Less, maybe. I'm stronger than he is. A bit. Better if I do it. He turned to face northeast, and with no more warning, a vertical slash of silver blue appeared beside the track-marked stone. Anura jerked her mare out of the way with a loud gasp as the line of light widened into an opening, a hole in the air that showed a sunlit clearing on steep ground among trees much smaller than those around Perrin and the others. The already splintered pine shivered as it lost another thin slice, groaned, and collapsed the rest of the way
Double
with a
dab,
snow-muffled crash that made the horses snort and dance. Anura glared at the Ashaman, her face growing dark, but Grady just blinked and said, Does that look like the right place? Elias adjusted his hat before nodding. That nod was all Perrin waited for. He ducked his head and rode stepper through into snow that was over the Dun's fetlocks. It was a small clearing, but the sky full of white clouds overhead made it seem vastly open after the forest behind. The light was almost blinding compared to the forest, but the sun was still hidden by the tree-covered ridge above. The Shido camp lay on the other side of that ridge. He stared toward the height yearningly. It was all he could do to stay where he was, rather than race ahead to finally see where Fayul was. He made himself turn stepper to face the gateway as Marlene came out. Still studying him, hardly taking her eyes away long enough to place her feet in the snow without tripping, she moved to one side to let Aram and the 2 Rivers men ride through. Accustomed to traveling, if not to Ashaman by now, they barely bent their heads enough to clear the top of the opening, and only the tallest did even that. It struck Perrin that the gateway was larger than the first one of Grady's make that he had passed through. He'd had to dismount then. It was a vague thought, no more important than a fly buzzing. Aram rode straight to Perrin, tight-faced and smelling impatient and eager to be going on. And once Daniel and the others were out of the way, climbing down and communicating arrows to bows while they watched the surrounding trees, Belen appeared, peering grimly at the trees around them as though he expected an enemy to come dashing out, followed by half a dozen Mayans who had lowered their red-streamered lances to crowd through after him.
Wedding crash.
A long pause passed with the gateway empty, but just when Perrin had decided to go back and see what was holding Elias up, the bearded man led his horse out, with Arganda and 6 Gildanon riding at his heels, discontent carved on their faces. Their shining helmets and breastplates were nowhere to be seen. They scowled as though they had been made to leave off their breeches.
Let me clean this lens real
Perrin
quick.
nodded to himself. Of course. The Shido camp was on the other side of this ridge, and so was the sun. That gleaming armor would have been like mirrors. He should have thought of that. He was still letting fear goad him into impatience and cloud his thinking. He had to be clear-headed, now more than ever. The detail he missed now could kill him and leave Fayul in Shido hands. It was easier to say that he had to let go of fear than to do it, though. How could he not be afraid for Fayul? It had to be managed, but how? To his surprise, Anura rode through the gateway just ahead of Grady, who was leading his dark bay. Just as every time he had seen her pass through a gateway, she lay as flat on her mare as her saddle's high pommel would allow, grimacing at the opening that had been made with the tainted mill half of the power, and as soon as she was clear of it, she urged her horse as far up the slope as she could without entering the trees. Brady let the gateway snap shut, leaving the purple after image of a vertical bar in Perrin's eyes, and Nora flinched and looked away, glaring at Marlene, at Perrin. If she had been anyone other than an Aes Sedai, he would have said she was simmering in a sullen fury. Berling must have told her to come, but it was not Berling she blamed for having to be there. "From here, we go afoot," Elias announced in a quiet voice that barely carried over the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. He had said the Shadow were careless and had no sentries, or almost none, but he spoke as if they could be within 20 paces. "A man on a horse stands out. The Shadow aren't blind, just blind for Aiel, which means they see twice as sharp as any of you. So don't go skylining yourself on the crest. And try not to make any more noise than you can do. They aren't deaf either. They'll find our tracks eventually. Can't do much about that in snow. But we can't let them know we were here until after we're gone." Already sour over being shorn of his armor and plumes, Arganda began to argue about Elias giving orders. Not being a complete fool, he did it in a quiet voice that would not carry. But he had been a soldier since the age of 15. He had commanded soldiers fighting Whitecliffs, Altarans, and Almedicians. And as he was fond of pointing out, he had fought in the Aiel War and lived through the blood snow at Tarvalin. He knew it, and he did not need any bother woodsman to tell him how to put his boots on. Perrin let it pass, since the man did his complaining in between telling off 2 men to hold the horses. He really was not a fool, just afraid for his queen. Darlan left all of his men behind, muttering that lancers were worse than useless off their horses, and would probably break their necks if he made them walk any distance. He was no fool either, but he did see the black side first. Elias took the lead, and Perrin waited only long enough to transfer the thick, brass-bound cube of his looking-glass from Stepper's saddlebags to his coat pocket before following. The underbrush grew in clumps beneath the trees, which were mostly pine and fir, with clusters of others that were winter gray and leafless, and the terrain no steeper than the sandhills back home, if more rocky, presented no problems for Daniel and the other 2 Rivers men, who ghosted up the slope with arrows knocked and eyes watchful, almost as silent as the mist of their breath. Aram, no stranger to the woods himself, stayed close to Perrin with his sword out. Once he started to chop a tangle of thick brown vines out of his way until Perrin stopped him with a hand on his arm. Yet he made little more noise than Perrin, a faint crunch of boots in snow. It was no shock that Marlene moved through the trees as if she had grown up in the forest instead of the Aiel waste, where anything that could be called a tree was rare and snow unheard of, though it seemed that all of her necklaces and bracelets should have made some clatter as they swung. But Anura climbed with almost as little effort, floundering a little with her skirts, but deftly avoiding the sharp thorns of dead cat's claw and wading in vines. Aes Sedai usually found a way to surprise you. She managed to keep a wary eye on Grady, too, though the Ashaman appeared to be focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Sometimes he sighed heavily and paused for a minute, frowning toward the crest ahead, but somehow he never fell behind. Darlan and Arganda were not young men, nor accustomed to walking where they could ride, and their breathing began to grow heavier as they ascended, sometimes pulling themselves up from tree to tree. But they watched one another nearly as much as they did the ground, each unwilling to let the other outdo him. The 4 Gildan lancers, on the other hand, slipped and slid, tripped over roots hidden beneath the snow, caught their scabbards on vines, and growled curses when they fell on rocks or were stabbed by thorns. Perrin began to consider sending them back to wait with the horses, that or hitting them over the head and leaving them to be picked up when he returned. Abruptly, 2 Aiel stepped out of the undergrowth in front of Elias, dark veils hiding their faces to the eyes, white cloaks hanging down their backs, and spears and bucklers in hand. They were maidens of the spear by their height, which made them no less dangerous than any other Hogad Siswai, and in an instant 9 longbows were drawn, broadhead points aimed at their hearts. "You could get hurt that way, Twanda," Elias muttered. "You should know better, Sulin." Perrin motioned for the 2 Rivers men to lower their bows, and for Aram to lower his sword. He had caught their scents as soon as Elias had, before they stepped into the open. The maidens exchanged startled looks, but they unveiled, letting the dark veils hang down their chests. "You see closely, Elias Machera," Sulin said. Wiry and leather-faced, With her scar across one cheek, she had sharp blue eyes that could pierce like awls, but they still looked surprised now. Twanda was taller and younger, and she might have been pretty before losing her right eye and gaining a thick scar that ran from her chin up under her shuva. It pulled up one corner of her mouth in a half-smile, but that was the only smile she ever gave. "Your coats are different," Perrin said. Twanda frowned down at her coat, all gray and green and brown, then at Sulan's identical garment. "Your cloaks, too." Elias was tired to make that slip. "They haven't started moving, have they?" "No, Perrin Ibarra," Sulan said. "The Shido seemed prepared to stay in one place for a time. They made the people from the city leave and go north last night. Those they would let leave." She gave a small shake of her head, still perturbed by the Shido forcing people to become Gaishain who did not follow Giotto. "Your friends, Jundin Baron and Get Elia and Hugh Marwin, have gone after them to see if they can learn anything. Our spear sisters in Gaul are making their way around the camp again. We waited here for Elias Machera to return with you." She seldom let emotion into her voice, and there was none there now, but she smelled of sadness. "Come, I will show you." The two maidens turned up the slope, and he hurried after them, forgetting anyone else. A little short of the crest, they crouched, then went to hands and knees and them, following the last Spanish snow, peer past a tree over the top of the ridgeline. The four ascended there, fading into scattered brush and isolated saplings on the downslope. She was high enough to see for several leagues, across rolling ridges and around treeless hills, to where a dark band of forest began again. He could see everything he wanted to see, and so much less than he needed. He had tried to imagine the Shido camp from Elias's description, but the reality dwarfed his imaginings. 1,000 paces below lay a mass of low-aiel tents and every other sort of tent, a mass of wagons and carts and people and horses, spread well over a mile in every direction from the gray stone walls of the city halfway to the next rise. He knew the sprawl must be the same on the other side. It was not one of the great cities, not like Kimlin or Tervalan, less than 400 paces wide along the side he could see, and narrower on the others, it seemed, but still a city with high walls and towers, and what looked like a fortress at the northmost end. Yet the Shido encampment swallowed it whole. A year was somewhere in that great place. Fumbling his looking glass from his pocket, he remembered at the last instant to cup one hand for shade on the far end of the tree. The sun was a golden ball almost ahead of him, just shy halfway to its noonday height. A stray reflection from the lens could ruin everything. Groups of people leapt up in the looking glass, their faces clear, at least to his eye. Long-haired women with dark shawls over their shoulders, placed dozens of long necklaces. Women with fewer necklaces milking goats. Women wearing the cotton sword, sometimes carrying spears and bucklers. Women peeking from the deep cowls of heavy white robes as they scurried across snow, already trampled halfway to mud. There were men and children, too, but his eye skipped past them hungrily, ignored them. Thousands upon thousands of women, just counting those in white. "Too many," Marlene whispered. He lowered the glass to glare at her. The others had joined the maidens and him, all lying in a row in the snow along the ridgeline. The Two Rivers men were taking pains to keep their bowstrings up out of the snow without raising their bows above the ridgeline. Arganda and Galen were using their own looking glasses to study the camp below. Grady was staring down the slope with his chin propped in his hands, every bit as intent as the two soldiers. Maybe he was using the power in some way. Marlene and Denora were staring at the camp too, the ice shining from their lips, the wise one frowning. Perrin did not think Marlene had intended to speak aloud. "If you think I'll walk away just because there are more Shido than I expected," he began heatedly, but she broke in, meeting his scowl with a level look. "Too many wise ones, Perrin Ibarra. Wherever I look, I can see a woman channeling. Just for a moment here, a moment there. Wise ones do not channel all the time, but they are everywhere I look. Too many to be the wise ones of 10 septs." He drew a deep breath. "How many do you think there are?" "I think maybe all of the Shido wise ones are down there," Marlene replied, as calm as if she were talking about the price of barley. "All who can channel." All of them? That made no sense. How could they all be together here, when the shadows seemed to be scattered everywhere? At least he had heard tales of what had to be shadow raids all across Gildan and Amadisia, tales of raids here in Altara long before Fail was taken, and rumors from even farther. Why would they all be together? If the shadow intended to gather here, the whole clan, no. He had to deal with what he knew for fact. That was bad enough. How many? He asked again, in a reasonable tone. Do not growl at me, Paranebar. I cannot say exactly how many Shadow Wise Ones remain alive. Even Wise Ones die from sickness, snakebite, accident. Some died at Demise Wells. We found bodies left behind, and they must have carried away those they could for proper burial. Even Shadow cannot have abandoned all custom. If all who remain alive are below, and the apprentices who can channel, I would say perhaps 400, perhaps more, but fewer than 500. There were fewer than 500 Shadow Wise Ones who could channel before they crossed the Dragon Wall, and perhaps 50 apprentices. Most farmers would have shown more emotion over the barley. Still staring down at the shadow camp, Anura made a strangled sound, half a sob. 500? Light. Off the tower from one clan? Oh, light. We could sneak in the night. The way you sneaked into that White Cloak camp back home. Elias gave a grunt that might have meant anything, but did not sound hopeful. Sulan snorted derisively. We could not sneak into that camp, not with any real hope of getting out. You would be trussed like a goat for the spit before you passed the first tents. Baron nodded slowly. He had thought of slipping in under cover of darkness and somehow spiriting Fail away. And the others, of course.
I'll be right back.
She would not go without the others. He had never had any real belief that could work, though. Not against Aiel, and the size of the camp had quenched the last glimmers. He could wander for days among that many people without finding her. Abruptly, he realized that he was not having to fight down despair. The anger remained, but it was cold as steel in winter now, and he could not detect a single drop of the hopelessness that had threatened to drown him before. There were 10,000 Nalgad Siswai in that camp, and 500 women who could channel. Belen had the right of it. Prepare for the worst and all your surprises were pleasant ones. 500 women who would not hesitate to use the power as a weapon. Fail was hidden like one snowflake in a meadow covered with snow. But when you piled up so much, there was just no point in despair. You had to buckle down or be plowed under. Besides, he could see the puzzle now. Nat Torfin had always said any puzzle could be solved, once you found out where to push and where to pull. To the north and south, the land had been cleared farther from the city than the rise where he lay. Scattered farmhouses, none with smoke rising from its chimney, dotted the landscape, and rail fences marked out fields beneath the snow, but more than a handful of men trying to approach from either direction might as well carry torches and banners and blow trumpets. There seemed to be a road leading roughly south through the farms, and another roughly north. Useless to him, probably, but you never could tell.
Right.
John did not bring back some information about the city, though what
Me and my
would do when
brother
the city was
definitely
in the
do
middle of the
smoke a lot.
shadow, he could not begin to guess. Gaul and the maidens who were making their way around the camp would be
Yeah,
able to
like
tell
it,
him what
yeah.
lay beyond the next ridge.
But I do
A saddle in
more
that ridge,
dabs
the look of a
than
road
most
heading somewhere
hated.
east. Oddly, a cluster of windmills stood maybe a mile north of the saddle, long white arms turning slowly, and there appeared to be another group of windmills atop the next rise beyond. A row of arches, like a long narrow bridge, stretched down the slope from the nearest windmills all the way to the city walls. Does anybody know what that is? He asked, pointing. Studying it through the looking glass told him nothing except that it seemed made of the same gray stone as the wall. The thing was much too narrow for a bridge. It lacked sidewalls, and there did not seem to be anything for a bridge to cross. It is for bringing water, Sulan replied. It runs for 5 miles to a lake. I do not know why they did not build their city closer, but most of the land around the lake looks as if it will be mud when the cold goes away. She no longer stumbled over unfamiliar words like mud, yet a touch of awe remained in lake, in the idea of so much water in one place. You think to stop their water supply? That will surely make them come out. She understood fighting over water. Most fighting in the Waste started with water. But I do
Well,
not
I do
think
too. I just
the colors
go through my
directly
flour
inside
too
Baron's
much.
head. An explosion of hues so strong
Because
that
out
sight
of
and
the
hearing
ounce I
vanished.
bought not too long ago,
All
this
sight
is
except
all I
for the
got
colors
left.
themselves, at least. They were a vast time.
I should hopefully be
As if all
getting
the
another
times he
one,
pushed them out of his head and
which
built a
hopefully
dam
soon.
that they now smashed aside in a silent flood, swirling in soundless whirlpools that tried to suck him under. An image coalesced in the middle of it. Rand and Nynaeve, sitting on the ground facing one another, as clear as if they were right in front of him. He had no time for Rand. Not now. Not now. Clawing at the colors like a drowning man, clawing for the surface, he forced them out. Sight and hearing, the world around, crashed in on him. It's madness, Brady was saying in worried tones. Nobody can handle enough Sayadine for me to feel that far off. Nobody. No one can handle that much of Sayadar either, Marlene murmured. But someone is. The Forsaken? Anura's voice shook. The Forsaken, using some sangria I would never suspected. Or the Dark One himself. They were all three peering back to the north and west, and if Marlene looked calmer than Anura and Brady, she smelled as frightened and worried. Except for Elias, the others were watching those three with the look of men awaiting an announcement that a new breaking of the world had begun. Elias's face was accepting. A wolf would snap at a landslide carrying him to his death, but a wolf knew that death came sooner or later, and you could not fight death. It's Rand, Baron muttered thickly. He shuddered as the colors tried to return, but he hammered them down. His business. He'll take care of it, whatever it is. Everyone was staring at him, even Elias. I need prisoners, Sulin. They must send out hunting parties. Elias says they have sentries out a few miles, small groups. Can you get me prisoners? Listen to me carefully, Honora said, the words rushing out of her. She rose up out of the snow enough to reach over Marlene and seize a fistful of Perrin's cloak. Something is happening. Perhaps wonderful, perhaps terrible. But in any case, momentous. More so than anything in recorded history. We must know what. Grady can take us there, close enough to see. I could take us if I knew the weaves. We must know. Meeting her gaze, Perrin raised his hand, and she stopped with her mouth open. Aes Sedai never shut up that easily, yet she did. I told you what it is. Our work is right down there in front of us. Sulin? Sulin's head swung from him to the Aes Sedai to Marlene. Finally, she shrugged. You will
A
learn
lot
little
of times
useful.
when I roll a
even if you
joint
put
or
them
a
to the
little
question.
bowl, I'll mix a little bit
They
of
will
a
embrace the pain
little
and
bit
laughter,
dabs in there with it.
and shame will be slow. If the
Didn't do it on
shadow
this
can
one.
still be shamed. Whatever I learn will be more than I know now, he replied. His work lay in front of him. A puzzle to solve, Fail to free, and the shadow to destroy. That was all that mattered in the world.
Chapter 9. Traps. And she complained again that the other wise ones are timid. Fail finished in her best meek voice, shifting the tall basket she held balanced on one shoulder, shifting from foot to foot in the muddy snow. The basket was not heavy, though filled with dirty laundry, and the wool of her white robe was thick and warm, with 2 underrobes beneath. But her soft leather boots, themselves bleached white, gave little protection from the cold slush. I was told to report what the wise one, Savannah, said exactly, she added quickly. So Merrin was one of the other wise ones, and her mouth had turned down at the word timid. With her eyes lowered, that was all Fail could see of Sir Merrin's face. Gaishain were required to maintain a humble manner, especially the Gaishain who were not Aiel. And though she looked up through her eyelashes to read Sir Merrin's expression, the other woman was taller than most men, even Aiel men, a yellow-haired giant who towered over her. Most of what she could see was Sir Merrin's overlarge bosom, plump, sun-dark cleavage exposed by a blouse unlaced halfway down her chest, and covered mainly by a massive collection of long necklaces, fire drops and emeralds, rubies and opals, three-tiered strands of fat pearls, and intricately patterned chains of gold. Most of the wise ones seemed to dislike Savannah, who spoke for the chief, until a new Shido clan chief could be chosen, an event unlikely to occur anytime soon, and they tried to undercut her authority whenever they were not squabbling among themselves or forming cliques. But many shared Savannah's love of Wetlander jewelry, and
Nice.
some had even begun wearing finger rings like Savannah. On her right hand, Somerin wore a large white opal that flashed caverns of red whenever she adjusted her shawl, and a long blue sapphire surrounded by rubies on the left. She had not adopted silk clothing, however. Her blouse was plain white algoda from the waist, and her skirt and shawl thick wool, as dark as the folded scarf that held her waist-long yellow hair back from her face. The cold did not appear to discomfort her in the least. The two of them stood just beyond what Fail thought of as the border between the Shido camp and the Gaishan camp, the prisoners' camp. Not that there really were two camps. A few Gaishan slept among the Shido, but the rest were kept to the center of the camp unless doing their assigned work. Cattle, fenced off from the lure of freedom by a wall of Shido. Most of the men and women who passed them wore white Gaishan robes, though few as finely woven as what she wore. With so many to clothe, the Shido scooped up any sort of white cloth they could find. Some were garbed in layers of coarse linen or toweling, or robes of rough tent cloth, and many of the robes were stained with mud or soot. Only now and then did one of the Gaishan show the height and pale eyes of an Aiel. The vast majority were ruddy-faced Amadisians, olive-skinned Altarans, and pale Kyrianen, along with occasional travelers or merchants from Ilion or Tarabon or elsewhere who had found themselves in the worst place at the worst time. The Kyrianen were the longest held and most resigned to their situation, aside from the handful of Aiel in white, but they all kept their eyes down and moved about their tasks as fast as the trampled mush of snow and mud would allow. Gaishan were expected to display humility, obedience, and an eagerness to embrace both. Any less resulted in painful blindness. Fail would very much have liked to hurry on her feet. Cold feet were only a small part of it, and eagerness to do Savannah's laundry less. Too many eyes could see her standing there in the open with Somerin, and even with her deep cowl hiding her face, the broad mesh belt of shiny gold links around her waist, and a close-fitting collar to match, marked her as one of Savannah's servants. No one called them that. In Aiel eyes, being a servant was demeaning, but that was what they were, the Wetlanders at least, just unpaid and with fewer rights and less freedom than any servant Fail had ever heard tell of. Sooner or later, Savannah herself was going to learn that wise ones were stopping her Gaishan to question them. Savannah had well over 100 servants and kept adding to them, and Fail was certain that every last one was repeating every word they heard Savannah say to the wise ones. It was a brutally efficient trap. Savannah was a harsh mistress, in a rather casual way, never snappy, seldom openly angry, but the slightest infraction, the smallest slip in demeanor or behavior, was punished immediately with the switch or the strap, and every night the 5 Gaishan who had pleased her least that day were chosen out for further punishment, sometimes a night bound and gagged on top of a beating, just to encourage the rest. Fail did not want to think of what the woman had ordered to spy. On the other hand, the wise ones had made it clear that anyone who did not talk freely of what they heard, anyone who tried to hold back or bargain, faced an uncertain future, possibly ending in a shallow grave. Harming a Gaishan beyond the permitted limits of discipline was a violation of Jit Ito, the web of honor and obligation that governed the lives of Aiel. But Wetlander Gaishan seemed to stand outside a number of the rules. Sooner or later, one side or the other of that trap would snap shut. All that had held the jaws apart this long was that the Shido seemed to see their wetlander Gaishine as no different from cart horses or pack animals, though in truth the animals received far better treatment. Now and then a Gaishine tried to run away, but aside from that, one simply gave them food and shelter, put them to work, and punished them if they faltered. The wise ones no more expected them to disobey. Savannah no more expected them to spy on her than they expected a cart horse to sing. Sooner or later, though, and that was not the only trap Fail was caught in. Wise one, I have nothing more to tell, she murmured when Somerin said nothing. Unless you were addled in the head, you did not just walk away from a wise one, not until she dismissed you. The wise one, Savannah, talks freely in front of us, but she says little. The tall woman remained silent, and after a long moment, Fail dared to raise her eyes a little more. Somerin was staring over Fail's head, her mouth hanging open in stunned amazement. Frowning, Fail shifted the basket on her shoulder and looked behind her, but there was nothing to account for Somerin's expression, just the sprawl of the camp. Dark, low Aiel tents mingled with peaked tents and walled tents and every sort of tent, most in shades of dirty white or pale brown, others green or blue or red or even striped. The Shido took everything valuable when they struck, everything that might prove useful, and they left behind nothing that resembled a tent. As it was, they hardly had enough shelter to go around. There were 10 sets gathered here, more than 70,000 Shido, and nearly as many Gaishine by her estimate, and everywhere she saw only the usual bustle, dark-clad Aiel going about their lives among scurrying white-clad captives. A smith was working the bellows on his forge in front of an open tent with his tools laid out on a tanned bull hide. Children were herding flocks of bleating goats with switches. A trader was displaying her goods in an open pavilion of yellow canvas, everything from golden candlesticks and silver bowls to pots and kettles, all looted. A lean man with a horse on a lead stood talking with a gray-haired wise one named Mathalin, no doubt seeking a cure for some ailment the animal had, from the way he kept pointing at the horse's belly. Nothing to make Somerin gape. Just as Fail was about to turn back around, she noticed a dark-haired Aiel woman facing the other way. Not just dark hair, but hair black as a raven's wing, a great rarity among Aiel. Even from behind, Fail thought she recognized Alaris, another of the wise ones. There were over 400 wise ones in the camp, but she had learned quickly to know all of them on sight. Mistaking a wise one for a weaver or a potter was a quick way to earn a switching. It might have meant nothing that Alaris was standing stock still and looking in the same direction as Somerin, or that she had let her shawl slide to the ground, except that just beyond her, Fail recognized still another wise one, also looking off to the north and west, and slapping at people who walked in front of her.
I'll be right back.
That had to be Jasine, a woman who would have been called short, even if she were not Aiel, with a great mass of hair, red enough to make fire look pale, and a temper to match. Masalin was talking to the man with the horse and gesturing to the animal. She could not channel, but 3 wise ones who could were all staring in the same direction. Only one thing could account for it. They saw someone channeling up there on the forested ridgeline beyond the camp. A wise one channeling surely would not make any of them stare. Could it be an Aes Sedai? Or more than one? Better not to get her hopes up. It was too soon. A clout on her head staggered her, and she nearly dropped the basket. "Why are you standing like a lump?" Somerin snarled. "Go on with your work. Go, before I—" Aiel went, balancing the basket with one hand, lifting the skirts of her robe out of the muddy snow with the other, and moving as quickly as she could without slipping and falling in the muck. Somerin never hit anyone, and she never raised her voice. If she was doing both, it was best to be out of her way with no delay, humbly and obediently. Pride said to maintain a cool defiance, a quiet refusal to yield. Yet sense said that was the way to find herself guarded twice as closely as she was. The Shido might take the Wetlander Guy Shine for domesticated animals, but they were not completely blind. They must think that she had accepted her captivity as inescapable, if she were to be able to escape. And that was very much on her mind. The sooner the better, certainly before Perrin caught up. She had never doubted that Perrin was following her, that he would find her somehow. The man would walk through a wall if he took it into his head. But she had to escape before that. She was a soldier's daughter. She knew the Shido's numbers. She knew the strength Perrin had to call on, and she knew she had to reach him before that clash could take place. There was just the little matter of getting free of the Shido first. What had the wise ones been looking at? The Aes Sedai or wise ones with Perrin? Light she hoped not yet. But other matters took precedence, the laundry not least. She carried the basket toward what remained of the city of Malden, weaving through a steady flow of Guy Shine. Those leaving the city each carried a pair of heavy buckets balanced on the ends of a pole carried across the shoulders, while the buckets of those going in swayed empty on their poles. As many people as were in the camp required a great deal of water, and this was how it came to them, bucket by bucket. It was easy to tell the Guy Shine who had been inhabitants of Malden. This far north in Altara they were fair rather than olive-complected, and some even had blue eyes, but all stumbled along in a daze. Shido climbing the city walls in the night had overwhelmed the defenses before most of the residents knew they were in danger, and they still seemed unable to believe what their lives had come to. Fail searched for a particular face, though, someone she hoped would not be carrying water today. She had been looking ever since the Shido made camp here 4 days ago. Just outside the city gates, which stood open and shoved back against the granite walls, she found her, a white-clad woman taller than herself, with a flat basket of bread on her hip, and her hood pushed back just enough to show a bit of dark reddish hair. Chiad appeared to be studying the iron-strapped gates that had failed to protect Malden, but she turned away from them as soon as Fail approached. They paused side by side, not really looking at one another while they pretended to shift their baskets. There was no reason two Guy Shine should not talk to one another, but no one should remember that they had been captured together. Bane and Chiad were not watched as closely as Guy Shine serving Savannah, but that might change if anyone remembered. Almost everyone in sight was Guy Shine, and from west of the Dragon Wall besides. Yet too many had learned to curry favor by carrying tales and rumors. Most people did what they must to survive, and some always tried to feather their own nests, whatever the circumstances. They got away the first night here, Chiad murmured. Bane and I led them out to the trees and obscured the tracks coming back. No one seems to realize they are gone, as far as I can see. With so many Guy Shine, it seems a wonder these Shido notice any who run away. Fail heaved a small sigh of relief. 3 days gone. The Shido did notice runaways. Few managed a full day of freedom, but the chances of success increased with every day uncaught, and it seemed certain the Shido would move on tomorrow or the next day. They had not halted as long as this since Fail was captured. She suspected they might be trying to march back to the Dragon Wall and recross into the waste. It had not been easy talking Lasil and Arla into leaving without her. What finally convinced them had been the argument that they could carry word to Perrin of where Fail was, along with a warning of how many Shido there were, and a claim that Fail already had her own escape well in hand, and any interference by him might endanger that and her. She was sure she had made them believe all of that. She did have her escape in hand, in a way. She had several plans, in fact, and one of them had to work. But until this minute she had been half convinced the two women would decide their oaths to her required them to stay. Water oaths were tighter than oaths of fealty in some ways, yet they left considerable room for stupidity in the name of honor. In truth, she did not know whether the pair could find Perrin, but either way they were free, and she had only 2 other women to worry about. Of course, the absence of 3 of Savannah's servants would be noticed very quickly, within hours, and the best trackers would be sent to bring them back. Fail was accustomed to the woods, but she knew better than to pit herself against Aiel trackers. It was very unpleasant for ordinary Gaishine who ran away and were recaptured. For Savannah's Gaishine, it might be better to die in the attempt. At best, they would never be allowed the opportunity for a second try. The rest of us would have a better chance if you and Bane came with us, she said in a low voice. The flow of men and women in white carrying water by them continued, no one seeming to more than glance their way. But wariness had become ingrained in her these last 2 weeks. Light, it seemed more like 2 years. What difference can there be between helping Rasir and Arala reach the forest and helping the rest of us get further? That was despair talking. She knew the difference. Bane and Chiad were her friends and had taught her about Aiel ways, about Ito, and even a little maiden hand talk. And it did not surprise her when Chiad turned her head slightly to regard her with gray eyes that had nothing of Gaishine meekness in them. Nor did her voice, though she still spoke quietly. I will help you as far as I can, because it is not right for the shadow to hold you. You will not follow you, Ito. If I cast aside my honor and my obligations just because the shadow have, then I allow them to decide how I will act. I will wear white for a year and a day, and then they will release me or I will walk away, but I will not throw away who I am. Without another word, Chiad strode off into the throngs of Gaishine. Fail half raised a hand to stop her, then let it fall. She had asked that question before, receiving a gentler answer, and in asking again she had insulted her friend. She would have to apologize. Not to keep Chiad's help, the woman would not withdraw that, but because she had her own honor, even if she did not follow Ito. You did not insult friends and simply forget it or expect them to. Apologies must wait, though. They dared not be seen talking too long. Malden had been a prosperous city, a producer of good wool and great quantities of fair quality wine, but an empty ruin inside the walls now. As many of the slate-roofed houses were timber as were stone, and fire had gotten loose during the looting. The southern end of the city was half piles of blackened timbers decorated with icicles, half scorched roofless walls. The streets everywhere, whether stone-paved or dirt, were gray with wind-blown ash trampled into the snow, and the whole city stank of charred wood. Water was one thing Malden apparently never ran short of, but like all Aiel, the Shido placed a very high value on it, and they knew nothing of fighting fires. There was little in the Aiel waste that could burn. They might have let the entire city be consumed had they been finished with stealing, and as it was, they dithered over the waste of water before forcing Gaishine into bucket lines at spear point and letting the men of Malden bring out their pump wagons. Fail would have thought the Shido would at least have rewarded those men by allowing them to leave with the people who had escaped being chosen for Gaishine. But the men who worked the pumps were young and fit, just the sort the Shido wanted for their Gaishine. The Shido kept some of the rules regarding Gaishine. Women who were pregnant or had children under the age of 10 had been let go, and youths under 16, and the city's blacksmiths, who had been both mystified and grateful. But gratitude never entered into it. Furniture littered the streets, large overturned tables and ornate chests and chairs, and sometimes a crumpled wall hanging or broken dishes. Bits of clothing lay
I'll
everywhere,
be right back.
coats and breeches and dresses, most sliced to tatters. The Shido had seized anything made of gold or silver, anything that had gems, anything useful or edible. But the furnishings must have been hauled outside in the frenzy of looting, then abandoned, when whoever was carrying them decided that a little gilded edging or fine carving did not make them worth the effort. Aiel did not use chairs in any case except for chiefs, and there was no room on the carts and wagons for any of those heavy tables. A few Shido still wandered through, searching the houses and inns and shops for anything they might have missed, yet most people she saw were Gaishain carrying buckets. Aiel had no interest in cities except as storehouses to be plundered. A pair of maidens passed her, using the butts of their spears to drive a naked, wild-eyed man, his arms bound behind him toward the gates. Doubtless he had thought he could hide in a basement or attic until the Shido were gone. Doubtless the maidens had thought to find a cache of coin or plate. When a huge man in the cut-in sore of the Algai de Siswai stepped in front of her, she swerved to go around him as smoothly as she could. A Gaishain always made way for any Shido. "You are very pretty," he said, putting himself in her way. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, perhaps 7 feet tall and thick in proportion. Not fat. She had never seen a fat Aiel, but very wide. He belched, and she smelled wine fumes. Drunken Aiel she had seen, since they found all those casks of wine here in Malden. She felt no fear, though. Gaishain might be punished for any number of infractions, often for transgressions few of the wetlanders understood, but the white robes gave a certain protection, too, and she had another layer besides. "I am Gaishain to the Wise One, Savannah," she said, in as obsequious a tone as she could manage. To her disgust, she had gotten so she could manage it very well. "Savannah would be displeased if I shirked my duties to talk." She tried again to step around him and gasped when he seized her arm in a hand that could have wrapped around it twice with inches to spare. "Savannah has hundreds of Gaishain. She will not miss one for an hour or two." The basket fell to the street as he plucked her into the air as easily as picking up a pillow. Before she knew what was happening, he had her tucked beneath his arm, her own arms trapped at her sides. She opened her mouth to scream, and he used his free hand to press her face flat against his chest. The smell of sweaty wool filled her nose. All she could see was gray-brown wool. Where were those two maidens? Maidens of the spear would not let him do this. Any Aiel who saw would step in. She never expected help from any of the Gaishain. One or two might run for help if she was lucky, but the very first lesson the Gaishain learned was that even a threat of violence got you hung up by the ankles and beaten till you howled. The first lesson wetlanders learned, at least. Aiel already knew. A Gaishain was forbidden to offer violence for any reason, which did not stop her from kicking at the man furiously. She might as well have been kicking a wall for all the impression it made. He was moving, carrying her somewhere. She bit down as hard as she could and got a mouthful of coarse, dirty wool for her pains, her teeth sliding over muscle with no slack to give her purchase. He seemed made of stone. She screamed, but her shriek sounded muffled even to her own ears. Abruptly, the monster carrying her stopped. "I made this one Gaishain, Nadrik," another man's deep voice said. Fail felt a rumble of laughter in the chest against her face even before she heard it. She did not stop her kicking, never stopped writhing or trying to shout, yet her captor seemed unaware of her efforts. "She belongs to Savannah now, brotherless," the huge man, Nadrik, said contemptuously. "Savannah takes what she wants, and I take what I want. It is the new way." "Savannah took her," the other man replied calmly. "But I never gave her to Savannah. I never offered to trade her to Savannah. Do you abandon your honor because Savannah abandons hers?" There was a long silence, broken only by the smothered noises Fail was making. She did not stop struggling, could not stop, but she might as well have been an infant in swaddling. "She is not pretty enough to fight over," Nadrik said finally. He did not sound frightened or even concerned. His hands fell away from her, and Fail's teeth ripped loose from his coat so suddenly she thought one or two might be jerked out, but the ground smashed into her back and all of the air rushed out of her lungs, along with most of the wits from her head. By the time she could gather enough breath to push up on her hands, the huge man was striding away down the alley, almost back to the street. It was an alley, a narrow track of dirt between two stone buildings. No one would have seen what he did back here. Shivering, she was not trembling, just shivering, spitting out the taste of unwashed wool and Nadric's sweat. She glared at his back. If the knife she had hidden away had been within reach, she would have stabbed him. Not pretty enough to fight over, was she? Part of her knew that was ludicrous, but she was grabbing hold of anything that could feed her anger just for the warmth of it, to help her stop shivering. She would have stabbed him and stabbed him until she could not lift her arms. Getting up on legs that wobbled, she explored her teeth with her tongue. They were all sound, nothing broken or missing. Her face had been scraped by the rough wool of Nadric's coat, and her lips were bruised, but she was unhurt. She reminded herself of that. She was unhurt and free to walk out of the alley. As free as anyone in Guyshine robes could be, anyway. If there were many like Nadric who no longer saw the protection of those robes, then order was breaking down among the Shido. The camp would be a more dangerous place, but disorder would bring more opportunities for escape. That was how she had to look at this. She had learned something that could aid her. If only she could stop shivering. At last, reluctantly, she looked at her rescuer. She had recognized his voice. He stood well back from her, watching her calmly, making no move to offer sympathy. She thought she would have screamed if he touched her. Another absurdity, since he had rescued her, but a fact all the same. Roland was no more than a hand shorter than Nadric, and almost as wide, and she had reason to want to stab him, too. He was not Shido, but one of the brotherless, the Meradin, men who had left their clans because they would not follow Randall Boor, and he had indeed been the one to make her Guyshine. True, he had kept her from freezing to death the night after she was captured by wrapping her in his own coat, yet she would not have needed the covering if he had not cut off every last stitch of her clothing in the first place. The first part of being made Guyshine was always being stripped, but that was no reason to forgive him for any of it. "Thank you," she said, the words sour on her tongue. "I do not ask for gratitude," he said mildly. "Do not look at me as though you want to bite me just because you could not bite Nadric." She managed not to snarl at him, barely. She could not have summoned meekness right then had she wanted to, before she turned away and stalked back out to the street. Well, she tried to stalk. Her legs were still shaking enough that it was more of a lurch. The passing Guyshine barely glanced in her direction as they trudged along the street with their water buckets. Few of the captives wanted to share anyone else's troubles. They had enough of their own. Reaching the laundry basket, she gave a sigh. It lay on its side, white silk blouses and dark silk skirts divided for riding spilled out over the dirty, ash-smeared pavement. At least it seemed no one had trodden on them. Anyone who had been carrying water all morning and had a day of it to look forward to could have been forgiven if they failed to step aside, with bits of clothing lying all around that had been cut off the people of Melvin who had been made Guyshine. She would have tried to forgive them. Righting the basket, she began gathering the clothes, shaking off the dirt and ash that would come loose, and careful not to grind in the rest. Unlike Somarin, Savannah had taken to silk. She wore nothing else. She was as proud of her silks as she was of her jewelry, and equally possessive of both. She would not be pleased if any of these garments failed to be returned clean. As Fail laid the last blouse atop the rest, Roland reached past her and lifted the basket with one hand. On the brink of snapping at him, she could carry her own burdens. "Thank you very much," she swallowed the words. Her brain was the only real weapon she possessed, and she had to use it instead of letting her temper have control. Roland had not been here by chance. That was straining credulity too far. She had seen him frequently since she was captured, much more often than chance could account for. He had been following her. What was it he had told Nadric? He had not given her to Savannah, or offered to trade her. For all that he had been the one to capture her, She thought he disapproved of making wetlanders guy shine. Most of the brotherless did, but apparently he still claimed his rights to her fate. She was sure she did not need to fear him trying to force her. Roland had had his chance for that when he had her naked and bound, and he could have been looking at a fence post then. Perhaps he did not like women in that way. In any case, the brotherless were almost as much outsiders among the Shido as the wetlanders. None of the Shido really trusted them, and the brotherless themselves often seemed like men holding their noses, accepting what they considered a lesser wrong rather than embrace a
I'll
greater,
be right
but
back.
no longer truly sure that it was lesser. If she could make a friend
I'm
of the
gonna do
man,
another
perhaps he would
dab.
be willing to help her. Not to escape, certainly. That would be asking too much. But, or would it? The only way to find out was to try. Thank you, she said again, and this time she worked up a smile. Surprisingly, he smiled back. A small smile, barely there at all, but Aiel were not demonstrative. They could seem stone-faced till you became used to them. For a few paces they walked along side by side in silence, he carrying the basket in one hand, and she holding up the skirts of her robes. They might have been out for a stroll, if you squinted. Some of the passing Guy Shine looked at them in surprise, but they always put their eyes down again quickly. She could not think of how to begin. She did not want him to think she was flirting. He might like women after all, but he took away the necessity. I have watched you, he said. You are strong and fierce, and not afraid, I think. Most of the wetlanders are frightened half out of their heads. They bluster until they are punished, and then they weep and cower. I think you are a woman of much G. I am frightened, she replied. I just try not to let it show. Crying never does any good. Most men believe that. Tears could get in your way if you let them, but a few tears shed at night could help you make it through the next day. There are times to weep and times to laugh. I would like to see you laugh. She did laugh, a dry laugh. There's little reason why I wear white, Roland. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Was she going too fast? But he only nodded. Still, I would like to see it. Smiles suit your face. Laughter would suit it even better. I have no wife, but I can make a woman laugh sometimes. I have heard you have a husband. Startled, Fail tripped over her own feet and caught herself on his arm. Quickly she snatched her hand away, studying him past the edge of her cowl. He paused long enough for her to steady herself, then walked on when she did. His expression was no more than mildly curious. Despite Nadric, Aiel custom was for a woman to do the asking, after a man attracted her interest. Giving her gifts was one way, making her laugh was another. So much for his not liking women. I do have a husband, Roland, and I love him very much. Very much. I can't wait to return to him. What happens while you are Gaishine cannot be held against you when you put off white, he said calmly. But perhaps you wetlanders do not see it that way. Still, it can be lonely when you are Gaishine. Perhaps we can talk sometimes. The man wanted to see her laugh, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. He was announcing that he did not intend to give up trying to attract her interest. Aiel really admired perseverance in a man. Still, if Tiad and Bane could not help beyond giving her aid in reaching the trees, Roland was her best hope. She thought she could convince him, given time. Of course she could. Faint hearts never succeeded. He was a scorned outcast, accepted only because the Shido needed his spear. But she was going to have to give him a reason to persist. I would like that, she said carefully. A little flirting might be necessary after all, but she could not go from telling him how much she loved her husband straight to wide-eyed and breathless. Not that she had any intention of going that far. She was no Dumhart. Yet she might need to come close. For the time being, a little reminder that Savannah had usurped his right would not go amiss. I have work to do now, though, and I doubt if I would be pleased if I spent the time talking to you instead. Roland nodded again, and Fail sighed. He might know how to make a woman laugh, as he claimed, but he certainly did not talk very much. She was going to have to work to draw him out if she intended to get anything more than jokes she did not understand. Even with Chiad and Bain's help, Aiel humor remained incomprehensible to him.
That one hurt a little bit.
They had reached the broad square in front of the fortress at the north end of the city, a towered mass of gray stone walls that had protected its inhabitants no better than the city walls. Fail thought she had seen the lady who had ruled Malden and everything for 20 miles around, a handsome, dignified widow in her middle years, among the Gaishine hauling water. White-clad men and women carrying buckets crowded the stone-paved square. At the eastern end of the square, what looked like a section of the city's outer wall, weighing 30 feet high, was actually the wall of a huge cistern fed by an aqueduct. 4 pumps, each worked by a pair of men, gushed out water to fill the buckets, a good bit more splashing to the paving stones than the men would have dared allow if they had known Roland was close enough to see. Fail had considered crawling through the tunnel-like aqueduct to escape, but they had no way to keep anything dry, and wherever it let them out, they would be soaking wet and more likely to freeze to death than make it more than a mile or 2 in the snow. There were 2 other places in the city to get water, both fed by stone conduits underground, but here a long, lion-footed blackwood table had been placed at the foot of the cistern wall. Once it had been a bench table, the top inlaid with ivory, but the ivory wedges had been pried out, and several wooden washtubs sat on the tabletop now. A pair of wooden buckets stood beside the table, and at one end a copper kettle steamed over a fire made from broken-up chairs. Fail doubted that Savannah had her laundry carried into the city to save her Gaishine the labor of hauling water out to the tents, but whatever the reason, Fail was grateful. A basket of laundry was lighter than full water buckets. She had carried enough of them to know. 2 baskets stood on the table, but only one woman wearing the golden belt and collar was at work, the sleeves of her white robe rolled up as high as they would go, and her long, dark hair tied with a strip of white cloth to keep it from falling into the washtub's water. When Alejandra saw Fail approaching with Roland, she straightened, drying her bare arms on her robe. Alejandra Maritha Kigarin, Queen of Gildan, Blessed of the Light, Defender of Garen's Wall, and a dozen more titles, had been an elegant, reserved woman, poised and stately. Alejandra the Gaishine was still pretty, but she wore a perpetually harried expression. With damp patches on her robes and her hands wrinkled from long immersion in the water, she could have passed for a pretty washerwoman. Watching Roland set down the basket and smile at Fail before striding away, watching Fail return the smile, she raised a quizzical eyebrow. "He's the one who captured me," Fail said, setting pieces of clothing from the basket on the table. Even here among none but Gaishine, it was best to talk while working. "He's one of the brotherless, and I think he doesn't really approve of making wetlanders Gaishine.
Hey,
I think he
Zoe, how
will
you
help us."
doing?
"I see," Alejandra said. With one hand she brushed delicately at the back of Fail's robe. Frowning, Fail twisted to look over her shoulder. For a moment she stared at the dirt and ash that covered her back from the shoulders down, then heat flooded her face. "I fell," she said quickly. She could not tell Alejandra what had happened with Nadric. She did not think she could tell anyone. Roland offered to carry my basket. Alejandra shrugged. "If he helped me escape, I would marry him. Or not, as he wanted. He's not quite pretty, but it wouldn't be painful. And my husband, if I had one, would never have to know. If he had any sense, he would be overjoyed to have me back and ask no questions he didn't want to hear answers to." Hands tightening on a silk blouse, Fail gritted her teeth. Alejandra was her liege woman, through Perrin, and she held to that well enough, at least insofar as obeying commands. but the nature of the relationship had become strained. They had agreed that they must try to think like servants, try to be servants if they were to survive, if that meant that each had seen the other curtsying and scurrying to obey. Savannah's punishments were dealt out by the nearest guy Shine to hand when she made her decision, and once Fail had been ordered to switch Alejandra. Worse, Alejandra had been ordered to return the favor twice. Holding back only meant a taste of the same for yourself, plus the other woman having to endure a double dose from someone who would not spare her arm. It had to make a difference when you had twice made your liege lady kick and shriek. Abruptly she realized that the blouse she was gripping was one of those that had picked up extra dirt when the basket fell. Loosening her grip, she examined the garment anxiously. It did not seem that she had ground the dirt in. For a moment she felt relief, and then irritation at being relieved. Even more irritating, the relief did not go away. Arla and Lacille escaped 3 days ago, she said in a low voice. They should be well away by now. Where is Megdin? A worried frown appeared on the other woman's face. She is trying to sneak into Therava's tent. Therava passed us with a group of wise ones, and from what we overheard, they seemed to be on their way to meet with Savannah. Megdin shoved her basket at me and said she was going to try. I think she's becoming desperate enough to take too many chances, she said with a touch of hopelessness in her own voice. She should have been here by now. Fail drew a deep breath and let it out slowly. They were all becoming desperate. They had gathered supplies for their escape, knives and food, boots and men's breeches and coats that fit near enough, all carefully hidden in the wagons. The white robes would serve as blankets and as cloaks to hide them in the snow. But the chance to use all that preparation seemed no closer now than the day they were captured. Only 2 weeks. 22 days, to be exact. That should not have been long enough to change anything, but their pretense of being servants was changing them in spite of all they could do. Only 2 weeks, and they found themselves jumping to obey commands without thought, worrying over punishments and whether they were pleasing Savannah. The worst of it was they could see themselves doing these things, knew some part of them was being molded against their wills. For now they could tell themselves they were just doing what was needed to avoid suspicion until they could escape, yet every day the reactions became more automatic. How long before escape was a pale dream dreamed in the night after a day of being a perfect guy Shine in thought as well as deed? No one had dared ask that question aloud so far, and Fael knew that she herself tried not to think it, but the question was always on the edge of her consciousness. In a way, she was afraid of it leaving. When it did, would it already have been answered? With an effort, she forced herself back from despondency. That was the second trap, and only willpower held it open. Megden knows she has to be careful, she said in a firm voice. She will be here soon, Alejandra. And if she is caught? She won't be, Fail said sharply. If she was. No, she had to think of victory, not defeat. Faint hearts never won. Washing the silk was time-consuming. The buckets of water they fetched from the cistern pumps were icy cold, but hot water scooped from the copper kettle brought the temperature in the wash tubs up to lukewarm. You could not wash silk in hot water. Sinking your hands into the wash tubs felt wonderful in the cold, but you always had to take them out again, and then the cold was twice as bitter. There was no soap, not that was mild enough anyway, so each skirt and blouse had to be submersed one by one and delicately scrubbed against itself. Then it was laid on a piece of toweling and gently rolled up to squeeze out as much water as possible. The damp garment was dipped again in another wash tub that was filled with a mixture of vinegar and water that reduced fading and enhanced the gloss of the silk, then rolled up in toweling again. The wet toweling was wrung out hard and spread in the sun to dry wherever there was room, while each piece of silk was hung on a horizontal pole slung in the shade of a rough canvas pavilion erected at the edge of the square and smoothed by hand to rub out wrinkles. With luck, nothing would need ironing. Both of them knew how silk had to be cared for, but ironing it needed experience neither of them had. None of Savannah's guy shine did, not even Meg did, though she had been a lady's maid even before entering Fail's service. But Savannah did not accept excuses. Every time Fail or Alejandra went to hang another garment, they checked those already there and smoothed any that seemed to need it. Fail was adding hot water to a washtub when Alejandra said bitterly, "Here comes the Aes Sedai." Galina was Aes Sedai, complete with the ageless face and a golden great serpent ring on her finger, but she wore white guy-shine robes too, in silk as thick as anyone else's wool, no less, along with a wide, elaborate belt of gold and fire-drops that cinched her waist tightly, and a tall matching collar around her neck, jewels fit for a monarch. She was Aes Sedai, and sometimes rode out from the camp alone, but she always returned, and she jumped when any wise one crooked a finger, especially Tharava, whose tent she often shared. In a way, that last was the strangest thing of all. Galina knew who Fail was, knew who her husband was, and Perrin's connection to Rand al'Thor, and she threatened to reveal it to Savannah unless Fail and her friends stole something from the very tent she slept in. That was the third trap lying in wait for them. Savannah was obsessed with al'Thor, insanely convinced that she could somehow marry him, and if she learned about Perrin, Fail would never be allowed far enough out of her sight to think of escape. She would be staked out like a goat to draw a lion. Fail had seen Galina slinking and cowering, but now the sister glided through the square like a queen, disdaining the rabble around her, an Aes Sedai to the hilt. There were no wise ones here for her to simper at. Galina was pretty, but nowhere near beautiful, and Fail did not understand what Tharava saw in her, unless it was simply the pleasure of dominating an Aes Sedai. That still left the question of why the woman remained, when Tharava seemed to take every opportunity to humiliate her. Stopping a pace from the table, Galina surveyed them with a small smile that might have been called pitying. "You are not progressing very far in your work," she said. She was not speaking of the laundry. It was Fail's place to do the talking, but Alejandra spoke up, even more bitterly than before. "Megden went to fetch your ivory rod this morning, Galina. When will we see some of the help you promised?" Help in their escape was the carrot Galina offered, along with the stick of threatening Fail's exposure. So far, however, they had seen only the stick. "She went to Tharava's tent this morning?" Galina whispered, the blood draining from her face. It dawned on Fail that the sun was halfway down to the horizon in the west, and her heart began to thud painfully. Megden should have joined them long since. The Aes Sedai seemed even more shaken than she. "This morning?" Galina repeated, looking over her shoulder. She gave a start and a cry when Megden suddenly appeared out of the throng of guy-shine crowding the square. Unlike Alejandra, the golden-haired woman had grown tougher by the day since their capture. She was no less desperate, but she seemed to focus it all into determination. She always had a presence that belonged more to a queen than a lady's maid, though most ladies' maids had it. But now she stumbled past them, dull-eyed, and plunged her hands into a water bucket, cupping a double handful to her mouth to drink thirstily, then scrubbing the back of the hand across her mouth. "I want to kill Tharava when we go," she said thickly. "I would like to kill her now." Her blue eyes took on life again and heat. "You're safe, Galina. She thought I was there to steal. I hadn't started looking. Something happened, and she left. After tying me up. For later." The heat faded from her gaze to be replaced by puzzlement. "What is it, Galina? Even I feel it. and I have so little ability these Aiel women decided I was no danger. Magdan could channel, not reliably, though, and not very much. From what little Fail knew, the White Tower would have sent her away in a matter of weeks, and she claimed never to have gone. So her ability would not be of much use in aiding their escape. Fail would have asked what she was talking about, but she never got the chance. Selina's face was still pale, but otherwise she was all Aes Sedai calm, except that she seized a handful of Magdan's cowl and the hair beneath and wrenched her head back. "Never you mind what it is," she said coolly. "Nothing to do with you. All you need worry about is getting me what I want. But you should worry about that very hard." Before Fail could move to defend Magdan, another woman wearing the wide golden belt over her white robes was there, pulling Galina away and slinging her to the ground. Plump and plain, Aravine had been weary-eyed and resigned the first time Fail saw her, the day the Amadisian woman handed her the golden belt she wore and told her she was now in the service of the Lady Savannah. The intervening days had stiffened Aravine even more than they had Magdan, though. "Are you mad to lay hands on an Aes Sedai?" Galina snapped, struggling to her feet. Brushing at the dirt staining her silk robes, she directed all her fury at the plump woman. "I will have you—" "Shall I tell Tharava you were manhandling one of Savannah's Gaishine?" Aravine broke in coldly. Her accents were cultured. She might have been a merchant of some note, or perhaps even a noble,
Excuse me.
but she never spoke of what she had been before putting on white. "The last time Tharava thought you'd poked your nose where she didn't want it, everybody inside 100 paces could hear you squealing and begging." Galina actually quivered with rage, the first time Fail had ever seen an Aes Sedai so outdone. With a visible effort, she gained control of herself. "Just." Her voice dripped acid. "Aes Sedai do what we do for our own reasons, Aravine. Reasons you could not possibly understand. You will regret incurring this debt when I decide to collect payment. You will regret it to your heart." Giving her robes a last brush, she stalked away, no longer the queen disdaining rabble, but a leopard daring sheep to block her path. Watching her go, Aravine seemed unimpressed and uninclined to chat. "Savannah wants you, Fail," was all she said. Fail did not bother to ask why. She just dried her hands, rolled down her sleeves, and followed the Aradisian woman, after promising Alejandra and Magdan to return as soon as she could. Savannah was fascinated with the three of them. Magdan, the only true lady's maid among her Gaishines, seemed to interest her as much as Queen Alejandra, and Fail herself, a woman powerful enough to have a queen as her liege woman, and sometimes she summoned one of them by name to help her change clothes or bathe in the large copper bathtub that she used more often than the sweat tent, or just to pour her wine. The rest of the time they were given the same chores as her other servants, but she never asked whether they had already been assigned work or left them off because of it. Whatever Savannah wanted, Fail knew she still would be held accountable for the laundry along with the other two. Savannah wanted what she wanted when she wanted it, and she did not accept excuses. There was no need for Fail to be shown the way to Savannah's tent, but Aravine led the way through the throng of water carriers until they reached the first low Aiel tents, and then she pointed in the opposite direction to Savannah's tent and said, "This way first." Fail stopped where she stood. "Why?" she asked suspiciously. There were actually men and women among Savannah's servants who were jealous of the attentions she gave Fail, Alejandra, and Magdan. And though Fail had never detected that in Aravine, some of the rest might well try to get them in trouble by passing on false instructions. "You will want to see this before you see Savannah. Believe me." Fail opened her mouth to demand more explanation, but Aravine simply turned and walked away. Fail gathered up the skirts of her robes and followed. All sorts and sizes of carts and wagons stood among the tents, their wheels replaced by sleds. Most were piled high with bundles and wooden crates and barrels, with the wheels tied on top of the loads. But she did not have to follow Aravine far before she saw a flatbed cart that had been emptied, except that the cart bed was not empty. Two women lay on the rough wooden planks, naked and cruelly hog-tied, shivering in the cold, yet panting as if they were running. Both women's heads hung tiredly, but as if they somehow knew Fail was there, both looked up. Arala, a dark tyrant as tall as most Aiel women, averted her eyes in embarrassment. Lacille, slim and pale, and Kairianen went bright red. "They were brought back this morning," Aravine said, watching Fail's face. "They will be untied before dark, since it's the first time they've tried to escape, though I doubt they will be in any condition to walk before tomorrow." "Why did you show me this?" Fail said. They had been so careful to keep the connection between them a secret. "You forget, my lady. I was there when you were all put in white." Aravine studied her a moment, then suddenly took Fail's hands and turned them so that her own hands were between Fail's palms. Bending her knees just short of kneeling, she said quickly, "Under the light and by my hope of rebirth, I, Arvin Carnell, do pledge my fealty to the goodness of all things to the Lady Fail Tebara." Only Lacille appeared to have noticed. The shadow walking past paid no mind to two Gaishine women. Fail jerked her hands free. "How do you know that name?" She had had to give more of her name than Fail, of course, but she had chosen Fail Bashir once she realized that none of the Shaido had a clue who Davram Bashir was. Aside from Aleandra and the others, only Galena knew the truth, or so she had thought. "And who have you told?" "I listened, my lady. I overheard Galena speaking to you once." Anxiety touched Aravine's voice. "And I have told no one." She did not sound surprised that Fail wanted to hide her name, though clearly Tebara meant nothing to her. Perhaps Aravine Carnell was not her true name, or not all of it. "In this place secrets must be held as closely as in Amador. I knew these women were yours, but I told no one. I know you intend to escape. I've been certain since the second or third day, and nothing I've seen since convinces me otherwise. Accept my oath and take me with you. I can help, and what is more, I can be trusted. I have proved it by keeping your secrets. Please." The last word came out strained, as if from someone unused to saying it. A noblewoman, then, rather than a merchant. The woman had proven nothing beyond that she could spy out secrets, but that in itself was a useful trait. On the other hand, Fail knew of at least two Gaishine who had tried to escape and been betrayed by others. Some people really did try to feather their own nests, no matter what the circumstances, but Aravine already knew enough to ruin everything. Fail thought about her hidden knife again. A dead woman could betray nothing, but the knife was half a mile away. She could think of no way to hide the body, and besides, the woman could have curried favor with Savannah just by saying she thought Fail was planning escape. Taking Aravine's hands between hers, she spoke as quickly as the other woman had. "Under the light I do accept your pledge and will defend and protect you and yours through battle's wrack and winter's blast and all that time may bring. Now, do you know anyone else who can be trusted? Not people you think you can trust, people you know you can?" "Not with this, my lady," Aravine said grimly. Her face shone with relief, though. She had not been sure Fail would accept her. That it was relief rather than anything else made Fail tend to believe in her. Tend to, which was not to say completely. Half would betray their own mothers in hopes of buying freedom, and the other half are too afraid to try or too stunned to be trusted not to panic. There must be some, and I have my eye on one or two, but I want to be very careful. One mistake is one more than I'll be allowed." "Very careful," Fail agreed. "Did Savannah really send for me?" If she didn't, it seemed that she had. And Fail was quick about reaching Savannah's tent. quicker than she would have liked, in truth. It was irritating to leap to avoid Savannah's displeasure, but no one paid her the slightest heed when she walked in and stood meek.
What happened? I'm not sure what happened, everyone.
Was
You have a good
irritating
night,
to leap
Fire.
to avoid Savannah's displeasure,
I'm not sure
but
what
no
happened
one
with that. It
paid
just
her
kind
the
of stopped.
slightest heed when she walked in and stood meekly by the entry flaps.
Oh, no, not yet.
Savannah's tent was no low Aiel structure, but a wall tent of red
I'm not sure
canvas
what
large
happened on
enough
that.
to need 2 center poles, lit by near a dozen mirrored stand lamps. 2 gilded braziers gave a little warmth, emitting thin tendrils of smoke that eddied out through the smoke holes in the roof. But the interior was little warmer than outside. Rich carpets, the snow carefully scraped away before they were laid, made a floor of reds and greens and blues, Tyran mazes and flowers and animals. Tasseled silk cushions lay strewn about the carpets, and one chair, a massive thing intricately carved and heavily gilded, sat in a corner. Fail had never seen anyone sit in it, but its presence was supposed to evoke the presence of a clan chief, she knew. She was just as happy to stand quietly with her eyes down. 3 other Gaishan with golden belts and collars, one a bearded male, stood along one wall of the tent in case some service was needed. Savannah was there, and so was Therava. Savannah was a tall woman, a little taller than Fail herself, with pale green eyes and hair like spun gold. She might have been beautiful except for a strong hint of avarice around her plump mouth. Little about her really seemed Aiel, beyond her eyes and hair and sun-dark face. Her blouse was white silk, her skirt divided for riding and also silk, if a dark gray, and the scarf folded around her temples was a blaze of crimson and gold, also silk. Red boots peeked out beneath the hem of her skirt when she moved. Jeweled rings decorated her every finger, and her necklaces and bracelets of fat pearls and cut diamonds and rubies as large as pigeons' eggs, sapphires and emeralds and fire drops paled anything Sumerian had. Not a single one was Aiel made. Therava, on the other hand, was all Aiel, in dark wool and white algoda, her hands bare and her necklaces and bracelets gold and ivory. No finger rings or gems for her. Taller than most men, her dark red hair touched with streaks of white, she was a blue-eyed eagle that it seemed must devour Savannah like a crippled lamb. Fail would rather anger Savannah 10 times than Therava once, but the 2 women faced each other across a table inlaid with ivory and turquoise, and Savannah met Therava glare for glare. "What is happening today means danger," Therava said, with the air of someone tired of repeating herself, and perhaps about to draw the knife at her belt. She caressed the head as she spoke, and not entirely absently, Fail thought. "We need to put as much distance between ourselves and whatever it is as we possibly can, and as soon as we can. There are mountains to the east. Once we reach them, we can be safe until we gather all the septs together again. Septs that would never have been separated if you had not been so sure of yourself, Savannah." "You speak of safety," Savannah laughed. "Have you grown so old and toothless you need to be fed milk and bread? Look, these mountains of yours are how distant? How many days or weeks when we must crawl through this cursed snow?" She gestured to the table between them where a map lay spread out, weighted down with 2 thick golden bowls and a heavy 3-pronged golden candlestick. Most Aiel disdained maps, but Savannah had taken to them along with other wetland customs. "Whatever happened is far away, Therava. You agreed it is so, as did every wise one. This city is full of food, enough to feed us for weeks if we remain here. Who is there to challenge us if we do? And if we do, you have heard the runners, the messengers. In 2 or 3 weeks, 4 at the most, 10 more sects will have joined me. Perhaps more. This snow will have melted by then if these wetlanders from the city can be believed. We will travel quickly instead of having to drag everything on sleds. Fail wondered whether any of the city people had mentioned mud. 10 more septs will join you, Tharava said, her voice flat except for the last word. Her hand tightened on the knife hilt. You speak for the clan chief, Savannah, and so I was chosen to advise you as clan chief, who must listen to advice for the good of our clan. I advise you to move east and keep moving east. The other septs can join us as easily in those mountains as here. And if we must go a little hungry on the way, who among us is a stranger to privation? Savannah fingered her necklaces, a large emerald on her right hand like green fire in the light of the stand lamps. Her mouth tightened and seemed hungrier for it. She might have known privation, but despite the lack of warmth in the tent, she no longer chose to. I speak for the chief, and I say we will remain here. There was more than a hint of challenge in her voice, but she did not give Tharava a chance to meet it. Ah, I see that Fail has come, my good, obedient Gaishan. Taking something wrapped in a cloth from the table, she stripped away the cloth. Do you recognize this, Fail Bashir? What Savannah held was a knife with a single-edged blade, a hand and a half long, a simple tool of the sort that thousands of farmers carry, except that Fail recognized the pattern of rivets in the wooden handle and the chip in the edge. It was the knife that she had stolen and hidden away with such care. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Gaishain were forbidden to possess any weapon, even a knife, except when cutting meat or vegetables for cooking. She could not help jerking when Savannah went on, though. As well, Galena brought me this before you could use it, for whatever purpose. If you stabbed someone, I would have to be very angry with you. Galena? Of course. The Aes Sedai would not allow them to escape before they did as she wanted. She is shocked, Tharava. Savannah's laughter was amused. Galena knows what is required of Gaishain, Fail Bashir. What should I do with her, Tharava? That is advice you can give me. Several wetlanders have been killed for hiding weapons, but I would hate to lose her. Tharava tipped Fail's chin up with a finger and stared into her eyes. Fail met that gaze without blinking, but she felt her knees tremble. She did not try telling herself it was only the cold. Fail knew she was not a coward, but when Tharava looked at her, Fail saw herself as a rabbit in that eagle's talons, alive and waiting for the beak to descend. It had been Tharava who first told her to spy on Savannah, and however circumspect the other wise ones might have been, Fail had no doubt that Tharava would slit her throat without the slightest qualm if she failed her. There was no use pretending the woman did not frighten her. She just had to control that fear, if she could. I think she was planning to run away, Savannah. But I think she can learn to do as she is told. The rough wooden table had been set out between the tents in the nearest open space to Savannah's tent, 100 paces away. At first, Fail thought that the shame of being naked would be the worst of it, that and the icy cold that pebbled her skin. The sun sat low in the sky. The air had grown colder, and it would get much colder before morning. She had to stay there till morning. The Shido were good at learning what shamed wetlanders, and they used shame as a punishment. She thought she would die of blushing whenever anyone looked at her, but the Shido who passed by did not even pause. In itself, nudity was no reason for shame among Aiel. Aravine appeared in front of her, but she stopped only long enough to whisper, "Keep your courage," and then she was gone. Fail understood. Whether or not the woman was loyal, she did not dare do anything to help. After a very short time, Fail no longer worried about shame. Her wrists had been tied behind her, and then her ankles had been doubled back and tied to her elbows. She understood now why Lucille and Arla had been panting. Breathing was an effort in this position. The cold bit deeper and deeper until she was shivering uncontrollably, but even that soon seemed secondary. Cramps began to burn in her legs, her shoulders, her sides, bunching muscles that seemed on fire, twisting tighter and tighter and tighter. She focused on not screaming. That became the center of her existence. She would not scream, but oh, light she hurt. Savannah
The chair
ordered that
helps
you
me
were
do
to
it live,
remain
but
here till dawn, Faye Bashir.
there's a
But
number
she
on the
did not
back.
say you could not have company. She had to blink several times before she could see clearly. Sweat stung her eyes. How could she be sweating when she was frozen to the marrow? Roland was standing in front of her, and strangely he was carrying a pair of low bronze braziers full of glowing coals, with pieces of cloth wrapped around the leg of each to protect his hands from the heat. Seeing her stare at the braziers, he shrugged. Once a night in the cold would not have bothered me, but I've grown soft
Oh,
since I
I
crossed
want
the
to get
dragon wall. She almost
Oh,
gasped
that
when
hurt.
he set the braziers beneath the table. Warmth flooded up through the cracks beneath the planks.
I
Her
bet you want to
muscles
get
still
that.
shrieked with
Just gotta
cramps.
save up the money
Oh,
for
the
one.
blessed warmth. She did
Oh, that
gasp
hurt.
when the man put an arm across her chest and the other across her bent elbows. Suddenly, she realized the pressure was gone from her elbows. He had squeezed her. One of his hands began working at her thigh, and she almost screamed as his fingers dug into knotted muscles, but she felt the knots begin to loosen. They still hurt. His massaging hurt, but the pain in that one thigh muscle was changing in kind. Not growing less exactly, but she knew that it would if he continued. You do not mind if I occupy myself while I try to think of a way to make you laugh, do you? He asked. Suddenly she realized that she was laughing, and not hysterically. Well, it was only partly hysteria. She was trussed like a goose for the oven, and being saved from the cold for a second
I
time
was
by a
hoping this
man she
chair would
thought
be
maybe she
alright
would
for
not
doing
stab
them,
after
but
all. Savannah would be watching her like
I
a
don't know.
hawk from now on, and Sarava might be trying to kill her as an example. But she knew she was going to escape. One door never closed, but another opened. She was going to escape. She laughed until she cried. Chapter 10. A Blazing Beacon. The wide-eyed maid was more used to kneading bread dough than doing up rows of tiny buttons, but eventually she finished buttoning Elaine into her dark green riding dress, curtsied, and stepped back, breathing heavily, though whether from the effort of concentration or just from being in the presence of the daughter heir was hard to tell. The great serpent ring on Elaine's left hand might have had something to do with it, too. Just over 20 miles in a straight line would take you from the manor of House Matherin to the river Erin and all its great fun. But the distance was far greater in actual miles to be covered through the Chishin Mountains, and people here were more accustomed to cattle raids across the border from Murundi than any sort of visitor, especially a visitor who wrapped the daughter heir and an Aes Sedai into one package. The honor seemed beyond what some of the servants could bear. Elsie had been painfully conscientious in folding the blue silk gown that Elaine had worn last night and packing it away in a large leather traveling chest, one of a pair in the apartment's dressing room, so conscientious that Elaine had nearly taken over the task herself. She had slept poorly at first, fitful and waking, then slept late when she could sleep, and she was beyond chafing to be on her way back to Camelin. This was the fifth time she had spent a night out of Camelin since learning the city was threatened, and on each trip she had given a day to visiting 3 or 4 manors, once 5, all the property of men and women bound to House Trakand by blood or oaths, and every visit took time. The press of time weighed down her bones, yet presenting the proper image was necessary. Riding clothes were needed to travel from one manor to the next, lest she arrived rumpled and looking a fugitive, but she had to change before settling in, whether it was for the night or just a few hours. Half those hours might be taken up by shifting from riding clothes to a gown and back again, but riding clothes spoke of haste and need, perhaps of desperation, while the coronet of the daughter heir and an embroidered gown trimmed with lace, unpacked from a set of traveling cases and donned after washing, portrayed confidence and strength. She would have brought her own maid to add to the impression if
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this life for tonight. I may or may not be on tomorrow. It all depends. I'm not sure because I had to use this chair again. So, but more likely I'll still be on. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.